sorry about the Unabomber-style manifesto that I'm reading from, but it makes it sort of easier for me to look at my well-crafted thoughts. So I study failure, which doesn't always make you the most popular person in an institutional setting, but I find that failure is really interesting, and that we should be spending more time talking about failure in e-government and e-learning, and perhaps less time just celebrating accomplishments. I'm also interested in an area called procedural rhetoric. And what that means is that I'm not just interested in verbal or visual rhetoric, so rhetoric about computation, but I'm actually interested in the ways that platforms, interfaces, and code shape rhetorical interactions. In other words, create the conditions for communication in the public sphere, or the constitution of what might be called, in Bruno Latour's words, things public. And I also am an administrator. I run a program, an interdisciplinary program called Culture, Art, and Technology that is devoted to doing experiments in how higher education could be different if we tried different forms of active learning. A lot of it is technologically enhanced. Some of it is very low tech, and a lot of it involves things like art making and public engagement in communities. So I'd like to tell a couple of stories today, and then maybe offer some ways that those stories could be unpacked. So I'm going to tell two stories about transgression, and so I'm going to kind of jump into the first one here. GMA, the woman's voice said when she answered the telephone on the opposite coast. The acronym was unfamiliar to me, so it took me a moment to realize that I had the right number for Good Morning America and was calling the correct person back from the popular ABC television show. Months before, I had written an item on my blog about the existence of online cheating tech videos created by high school and college students that demonstrated elaborate techniques designed to boost examination scores. The videos showed step-by-step how to create fake drink bottle labels in Photoshop to hide formulae, how to stuff pen shafts with answer scrolls, and how to write detailed information about foreign language conjugations on stretched out rubber bands. Most of the videos had low production values and were shot in domestic settings, but at least one Japanese video borrowed the actual form of a commercial distance learning unit with distinct chapters on the subject of cheating. And the lessons were elaborated with slick information graphics and computer-generated animations to enhance the instructional content. My story about those academic dishonesty videos on the popular video sharing site YouTube had been picked up by the Chronicle of Higher Education. Then a reporter from the Shreveport Times ran an article about the subject for which I was interviewed, which later appeared in a large circulation paper, the Chicago Sun-Times. From there, the story reached researchers at Good Morning America, who thought it had the right kind of national light news appeal for mainstream audiences who might be waking up to their broadcast or watching television over breakfast before starting morning commutes. Although I was an academic, Good Morning America apparently hoped that I might be an adequately colorful commentator for the show to speak to the phenomena of a new kind of online dishonesty. I thought the cheating videos were interesting because they demonstrated an argument that I've been developing over the course of the past decade. First, formal institutions of codified pedagogy, represented by universities, and informal learning among people who were largely self-taught, were increasingly in conflict when it came to their respective everyday practices and long-term goals. Second, access to and use of computational media frequently exacerbated this tension. I thought the situation was particularly unfortunate in an era of socially networked computing, where one would hope that academic and popular forms of instruction would be converging to work in concert to support a lifelong culture of inquiry, collective intelligence, and distributed research practices. Certainly the students in the video were sharing tips and performing online knowledge networking activities that constituted a form of real learning, even if it would be considered objectionable by their professors, who would understandably see it as a fundamental violation of the scholarly social contract. In these cheating videos, the students were demonstrating that they understood the procedures of their own educational institutions and how a different approach to the sequences of operations involved in the minutiae of test taking might guarantee higher scoring success. They had achieved mastery of something that seemed relevant to success in the university, but it wasn't what their professors wanted them to have learned in their courses of study. In addressing the hundreds of thousands who watched such videos, students weren't the only ones in the implied audience. These videos appeal to many non-academic viewers who enjoy watching the hacking of obstreperous or powerful systems. Academic viewers who enjoy watching like videos about fooling electronic voting booths, hacking vending machines, opening locked cars with tennis balls, or smuggling contraband goods through airport X-ray devices. Obviously, I'm showing my own YouTube viewing habits by giving you that list of things, because pretty much I love those videos too. These cheating videos also belong to a broader category of YouTube videos for do-it-yourself enthusiasts, those who like to see step-by-step execution of a project from start to finish online. YouTube videos about crafts, cooking, carpentry, decorating, computer programming, and installing consumer technologies all follow the same basic format. And popular magazines like Make have capitalized on this subculture of avid project-based participants. Although these cultural practices may seem like a relatively new trend, one could look at DIY culture as part of a longer tradition of exercise devoted to imitatio, or the art of copying master works, which have been central to rhetorical instruction for centuries. Unfortunately, by the time the production offices for Good Morning America called my university months after my initial blog posting, the story of these students' acts of ingenuity had become transformed by the producers into lurid evidence for yet another internet moral panic. Somewhere between the predator panic, when the news seemed to be all about innocent young people as the prey of online sexual deviance, and the bullying panic about the cruelty of the young themselves toward their peers, there were a variety of miscellaneous panics being aired on national television with horrified glee. My conversation with the GMA staffer quickly became strained, and not just because my travel schedule was hard to accommodate. The show clearly wanted a voice of moral outrage that defended tradition and condemned the lax values of the young from the elevated position of a stereotypically highbrow college professor. Several times I was prompted to say how reprehensible I must think the behavior of the video makers was. At the same time, the woman from ABC was unable to suppress her voyeuristic pleasure in having lined up two of the actual student perpetrators who produced the offending videos so they could be paraded through the public in their unrepentant condition. So that's story one, is cheating videos on YouTube. So then there's story two. And story two takes place at my own institution. So here's story two. In 2010, I visited a course designed to teach digital literacy skills to college freshmen that was being held in 3 rooms. One offered a live faculty member pacing the stage, while the other rooms presented a broadcast version of her performance. It was a required general education course that focused on teaching Alice, an object-oriented computer programming language designed for K-12 students with a simple graphical user interface. I was skeptical about whether Alice was the right programming language to teach college students, but I knew that the lecturing faculty member had a good reputation for innovative teaching and deploying student-centered learning techniques, so I was coming to the class with an open mind. At the beginning of the quarter, students in all 3 rooms had purchased wireless handheld clickers that could monitor their class attendance and assure their attention did not wander too far from the subject matter during class time, and hopefully measure their performance at reaching the course's stated learning goals. During my visit to the class, I soon noticed the students perked up each time that the screen displayed multiple choice questions about computer programming techniques. only because they had to select the best answer quickly among several plausible choices as a digital clock counted down. Not all of the questions on the screen were straightforward problem-solving tasks about choosing the right line of code or the right order on the right operation. Sometimes the questions involve fundamental definitions or more abstract reasoning about why to choose a particular approach. To encourage collaborative learning, students could also periodically confer with each other in small groups and debate the merits of the different answers. In the clicker room, with the live performance by the professor, I watched about 45 minutes of a college instructor trying to do everything right. In addition to clicker quizzes and small group discussions, she encouraged active learning by soliciting questions and comments from students using a microphone. Despite her best efforts, about half the students in the lecture hall were partially engaged. They only paid attention during the quiz portions of the session. Much of the time, these students seemed to be considerably more interested in non-class related activities on laptops and cell phones that involved games and social network sites. The other half behaved more attentively, like students who could see the professor and be seen. Occasionally, there were small dramas in a lecture hall when a student could not get his or her clicker to function, and there would be a flurry of desperate activity around supplying batteries for the dead clicker from clickers that had already clicked in before the ticking clock ran out of time. I then went to a large lecture hall to the immediate right of the live lecture, where no professor was actually present. It was part of an initiative intended to pilot a distance learning course that would teach computer programming to AP computer science students who might not have such courses offered at their high schools, which was being tested on first-year students. No one was at the podium of this lecture hall. The faculty lecture appeared only as a fuzzy apparition moving around on the right screen. The room was brightly lit, like the first lecture hall, but students were much more disengaged from the spectral lecturer and her phantom interactive activities, even though the content delivered was identical to that in the room just next door. And they were also being held accountable for the content periodically with clicker quizzes. Almost all of the students in this class were texting and web surfing all around me, with only brief pauses to answer quiz questions with their clickers. Some of the students were engaged in highly inappropriate behavior. Students applied makeup, talked on cell phones, and held conversations at regular volume with each other about matters unrelated to class. In this lecture hall, small group discussions quickly strayed into non-class related topics, and student teaching assistants patrolling the aisles with a microphone. I asked a graduate student, teaching assistant, patrolling the aisle with a microphone if students were ever discouraged from pursuing such non-class related activities, and he said never. Sitting in that lecture hall, I felt as though I was watching an experiment in digital learning that had gone terribly wrong. But no one seemed willing to tinker with the experimental protocol or question the basic assumptions about learning and teaching that were dramatized. In the lecture hall, the once covert war between us and them had turned into an open battle between our technologies and their technologies. On the one side, we, faculty, could reset countdown clocks and forgive clicker mishaps, but they had access to wireless networks and mobile telephony. My sensibilities as an educator were somewhat assaulted by this spectacle of mutual disrespect, but it seemed futile to try to engage anyone present in a conversation about what they were perpetuating and why. For the last 15 minutes of my observation, I took refuge in a much smaller room, which was configured like a large classroom rather than a lecture hall and located to the left of the live lecture. The room was dark, and the broadcast instructor was to the left of the live lecture. I'm sorry, the room was dark, and the broadcast instructor was projected with close-up shots on a relatively large screen, where students could clearly see the professor's facial expressions in the intimacy of the room. While viewing the same instructional content, this group was much more attentive than the group in the larger, brighter space, and behaved as if at a movie theater, with reverent silence. I was dispirited to see that there was also less interaction among students with each other during the discussion portions. This room, however, was standing room only. There was a kind of peace to be found in the passive darkness, a respite from the war on learning being staged under bright lights a few doors down. So those are two stories about bad behavior. Bad behavior at home, bad behavior in the classroom. What can we sort of say about the bad behavior and maybe where we stand on it? So the war on learning explores the assumption that digital media deeply divides students and teachers, and that a once covert war between us and them has turned into an open battle between our technologies and their technologies. So we, the faculty, control course management systems, online quizzes, wireless clickers, internet access to PowerPoint slides and podcasts, and plagiarism detection software. On the student side, they are armed with smartphones, laptops, music players, digital cameras, and social network sites, and seem to be masters of these ubiquitous computing and recording technologies that can serve as advanced weapons that allow escape to virtual or social realities far away from the lecture hall, or exposure of that lecture hall to the outside world, should they choose to document and broadcast the foibles of their faculty. Each side is not really fighting the other, I argue. Both opponents are conducting an incredibly destructive war on learning itself. I see problems both with using technologies to command and control young people and force them into submission to established authority, and with the utopian claims of advocates for DIY education or unschooling, who want to embrace a libertarian politics of each one for himself pedagogy and defund public institutions devoted to traditional learning communities and collectives to promote totally autonomous learning in individual private homes. Effective educators should be non-combatants, I'm claiming, neither champions of the reactionary past or the radical future. In making the argument for becoming a conscientious objector in the war on learning, I'm focusing on the present moment. Both sides in the war on learning are also promoting a particular causal argument about technology, of which I am deeply suspicious. Both groups believe that the present rupture between student and professor is caused by the advent of a unique digital generation that is assumed to be very technically proficient at navigating computational media without formal instruction, and is likely to prefer digital activities to the reading of print text. I've been a very public opponent of casting students too easily as digital natives for a number of reasons. Contemporary anthropology supplies a host of arguments against assuming preconceived ideas about what it means to be a native when studying group behavior. I'm particularly suspicious of this type of language about digital natives because it could naturalize cultural practices, further a colonial othering of the young, and oversimplify complicated questions about membership in a group. Furthermore, as someone who's been involved with digital literacy and now digital fluency for most of my academic career, I've seen firsthand how many students have serious problems with writing computer programs and how difficult it can be to establish priorities among educators, particularly educators from different disciplines or research tracks, when very diverse populations of learners need to be served. Yes?
I think the argument you're making is that the entire problem is because people are being labeled as digital natives, versus the problem being that classroom techniques which are being used are just wrong for anybody.
Well, I mean, I think that there's definitely labeling going on. And I think one of the things I talk about is the kind of the irony of the fact that some of the more interesting digital pedagogues are now people who are retiring. They're sort of early adopters who are actually leaving the world of digital media and learning, and that younger people who are coming into the academy often, there's a study by someone named Diane Harley, who's at the Center for Studies in Higher Education at Berkeley, who looks at how people teach in a higher education setting. And what she's discovering is that there's a lot of conservatism among faculty, new faculty, young faculty in all disciplines, not just humanities disciplines, because they're being advised by senior faculty members to just play it safe and be very conservative in the ways that they teach and really focus on research and just, kind of go get tenure. Don't take risky experiments. Don't try crazy things with your students. Don't do things that won't pay off. And So, I mean, I think that using age as a marker for competency is always a mistake, developmentally speaking. But I also think that development is really uneven. I'm just not sure that that's the only problem. I think there are a lot of problems.
I'm trying to understand whether you think, or whether the argument here is that the major problem is labeling, or the major problem is that people don't know how to teach in this new medium, right? Because the example that you gave with that split between three classrooms, to me seems to say the university doesn't really know how to, what's the right answer to this question.
Well, I think there's a great temptation when you have computational media, and I get into that later when I get to the case of my favorite guy, the baked professor. I don't know how many of you have seen this video. This is a business professor who was involved in a distance learning course at the University of Florida. And he began to give his lecture, and he had both live students and remote students. And he began his lecture by saying, "Listen, my children, and you will hear," and started to recite nursery rhymes. And then he started talking about the origins of different obscene words, and he flipped the bird at the camera, and he did a variety of kind of very bizarre activities. And he, of course, became an internet meme. I don't know how many of you have seen the Baked Professor video or any of the remixes of it. So there was a psychedelic remix. I mean, like anything that is made on the internet. But what's interesting about the video, there are two things to me that are interesting about the video that people miss. The first is he had minders in the room. So even though he obviously was under the influence of some pharmacological substance, he was clearly in an altered state during the time that he was giving what should have been a more conventional lecture. There were people who were participating in this sort of instructional technology spectacle. And the fact that his authority as a kind of lecturing figure, nobody was going to stop him, no matter how crazy he got, because it was an entirely one-way communication. So he could get just as loony as he wanted, but the rules of engagement were such that, that there was no way to kind of control him. And certainly the instructional technologists were not facilitators of learning in any way. They were just there to record his performance and make sure that everything went as it was supposed to go, which, of course, it did not at all. So that's one interesting factor about this video. The other interesting factor, however, is the subject of his lecture was actually scientific management. And the second part of the lecture, when he is, so people have all seen the first hour of his lecture, when he rolls around on the floor. He's he's using all sorts of language that you wouldn't normally use in a teaching interaction. He comes back after the break. He's still clearly disinhibited, but he's kind of got it together a little bit more. And he's got this lecture on scientific management planned, right? So he was going to go over theories about industrial production and ways that techniques of scientific management were used to kind of rationalize labor in the late 19th or early 20th centuries. So he starts talking about distance learning and scientific management. And he starts essentially complaining about the structure of distance learning as a kind of attempt to scientifically manage the academic labor of his institution, which was an interesting thing to say. Again, not something that was necessarily appropriate to say or rhetorically wise for him to say. No one paid any attention to this part, right? The kind of deeply subversive critique of his institution. They all focused on the kind of wacky hijinks of him rolling around on the ground. But what's interesting about it is that when you're working with computational media and distributed networks, and you can quantify all of these things about educational interactions, the temptation is strong to do so. Like because you can mathematically model information exchanges of various kinds and model all kinds of interactions. The tendency is to focus on the things that can be mathematically represented. So you get forms of learning that privilege things that are easy to represent mathematically rather than ones that are hard to represent mathematically. And you also get into that in the name of doing these experiments, like, so in the case of the professor giving the 3 lectures simultaneously, I actually did try to talk to people about how badly those classes were clearly going. And like, like it seemed relatively easy that like a TA could just ask people not to just text through the whole class. Like, why couldn't there be a human interaction where, if you need a laptop for a disability reason, please sit in the front row. If not, just please close your laptop. Please don't talk to your neighbor. Like, And they actually said that they had to do this sort of scientific protocol. They had to run the experiment all the way through to its disastrous end, because otherwise it wouldn't be a legitimate experiment. So I think that so there's this tendency toward quantification, but there's also a tendency toward thinking about education in terms of highly objectified protocols, rather than, this is ironic to me because there's all this research in cognitive science that shows how learning, and neuroscience, that shows how learning is closely tied to affect and identity and all of these things that are actually really not about quantifiable outcomes. And it seems that at a time that sort of science is actually telling us that emotion matters and affect matters, we're defining learning in increasingly kind of dispassionate, quantifiable ways. Does that sort of answer your question? It was a long answer.
I like to continue. I think you guys will answer through the rest of your talk. But yeah.
There are a lot of problems, I think would be probably my answer. Maybe I should sort of talk for a minute about angry professor remixes, which is something I'm kind of interested in too. There's a saying among people in the instructional technology movement, and the saying is, distance learning begins in the second row. Anyone who's observed a traditional large lecture hall course in the past decade recognizes the truth of that statement, and the serious lack of empathy or emotional connection that many students in the back row of the lecture halls of today feel toward their physically remote college instructors. From the cynical perspective of these highly disengaged students, professors might just as well be audio animatronic robots in the higher education theme park in which they plan to spend the next few years in merriment and diversion with their friends. No wonder such students would band together to make cheating a rite of passage, the logic goes, when professors seem unimportant and test scores are the only things that matter. And I realize that, when I say that, people here at Stanford can be like, oh, things aren't like that at Stanford. No, maybe not. That would be good if they weren't that way. Professorial hostility towards students anywhere beyond the first row seems magnified by access to technology. So this is a fun experiment. Type the words angry professor into a search engine and be prepared for videos of professors destroying digital devices or chiding their students for inattention. As the many remixes, parodies, and hoaxes generated around these angry professor videos demonstrates, trying to police student distraction this way only seems to feed the trolls. What might be less obvious to the uninitiated is that many of these incidents showing supposedly inflamed faculty performances online are actually hoaxes or spoofs. Some, such as teacher breaks student phone, now at over 1 million views, have obviously canned dialogue and are quickly called out as phony by viewers. I have a strict texting policy, professor destroys cell phone, and that's, of course, the title of the video, right? Has earned almost 700,000 hits, despite a faculty member looking at the camera awkwardly and a history lesson that would be too simplistic for most high school classes. Nonetheless, a campus newspaper took the texting policy video as genuine and ran a related story about class policies and disciplinary consequences that such a professor might face for destroying student property. Other videos may have more complicated reception histories if they've been passed on through online social networks as genuine evidence of faculty retaliation for exasperating student behavior. For example, Professor Kieran Mullen, a condensed matter theorist at the University of Oklahoma, explains on his faculty webpage that the video that shows him shattering a student laptop that he has frozen in liquid nitrogen depicts violence done to a machine that was, quote, non-functional before freezing, and that the putative owner is a, quote, plant from a willing student accomplice. However, Mullen goes on to assert that the video does enhance his message about how students, quote, in a large lecture class can be distracted by others watching movies, reading news websites, and playing games on their laptops. He also notes that he had, quote, warned students many times about not using their laptops during lecture, and that his demonstration did have the desired effect of improving student attention. Another video in which a professor destroys a cell phone, and as somebody who's interested in interactions between people and devices, I'm also working on a project that's kind of an epilogue to the Virtualpolitik book that's about Obama and his use of smart technologies, because I'm kind of fascinated with how is the BlackBerry shown on the Flickr page for the president, and how do we see Obama interacting with technology? Because of course, on the campaign trail, the image was Obama with his laptop and at least one smartphone in front of him, sometimes two. And so we have sort of the image of the multitasking president. And now if you look on the official Flickr website, you see Obama is often shown with like a corded phone, in this sort of John F. Kennedy kind of pose where he's kind of doing Cold War diplomacy on a landline, because that's presidential. And there's no multitasking, because multitasking would be unpresidential. And that when you see the BlackBerry, it's kind of hilarious, because the BlackBerry appears like he's either in the dark, outside, off stage. Like the message is always like, yes, you could check your BlackBerry, but you have to be somewhere else. So anyway, that's a long digression on Obama and instructional technology and smart technologies. But I'm also interested in like why these angry professor videos, why devices become the objects of violence. Like what is it about the interaction between student and device that's so much a kind of cultural stereotype? And that even these like hoaxes or spoofs seem to be taken as genuine, because there's such a strong belief in this animosity toward the device by faculty, and that there's a kind of wish fulfillment that's playing out that has this kind of power to it.
And 50 years ago, did people spoof crumpling up newspapers and stuff like that? Or, I mean, is this take whatever the current technology is and get mad at it? Or is there something different about laptops and newspapers?
I would argue that yes and yes. That you can argue that there's been a long history of the instructional technology movement that has looked at everything from using television in the classroom. Marshall McLuhan, in his 1969 Playboy interview, famously talked about TV as an educational tool, to film strips, to all these other sort of interests in how media function in relationship to the educational situation. There was the comic book panic, where there was anxiety about how comic books would undo educational settings. So I'd say, yeah, there's a continuum of both wanting to use new media for learning and feeling that new media work against learning. I'd say the thing that's different is that distributed networks, the ability to connect with remote others is different. That I think that it's harder to the classroom situation is changed by that experience. And I also think that the ability for students to self-organize more rapidly around those technologies And some of the sort of student rebellions that I look at have to do with students taking advantage of digital technologies to do kind of flash mob behavior in the classroom.
So going perhaps one level meta, do you ever see subverting of the subversion? That is, you see the staff actually use similar or different technologies to sort of get around these emergent practices?
I think there's an interest in trying to co-opt social media behaviors to try to. I think there are two approaches to anxiety about the behavior of students. One is, let's put in command and control. Let's put it, let's emphasize policing student behavior. But then there's the kind of kinder, gentler approach, which is, oh, let's try to use the technologies ourselves. And I also am fascinated with like terrible, just tone-deaf attempts by administrators and department chairs to try to kind of create media that students would find appealing with like no idea of like how that would work.
The attempted adaptation seems to be ill-considered. It's maybe the message here.
Yeah, I think that the problem is that the social realities of faculty and the social realities of students are very separate. And I think that we don't have good technologies for facilitating social learning yet. I think trying to use Facebook to foster learning or Twitter to foster learning is a very difficult proposition to do well. Some people, what? Well, I'd give a couple of different answers. I'd say there are expectations about genre, and that what you produce when you for a particular situation doesn't always translate well to the academic setting. I'd say that's one challenge. I'd say that that it's difficult to negotiate multiple authority positions simultaneously, and people don't know how to do that well. They don't know how to both be an authority figure and not be an authority figure online. That it's easier to do when you have a lot of paralinguistic information. It's easier to do like in an office hours situation where you can kind of constantly test how the interaction is going. I think it's harder for people to do electronically when they don't have the same sense of how it's going. But I think there are probably even more problems with doing it well. The doing it well part is actually the last chapter of the book, which is the part I have not written yet. So I always end my books with this is all, several chapters about disasters and poorly conceived ideas. And then the last chapter is going to be all about like the way forward. And as somebody who cares about the way forward, I should have more answers to that. But I actually think it's incredibly difficult. I'd say one answer is sometimes ditch the technology. Go to old media. Have students produce books. Have students work with paper prototypes. Have them just do things, think about technology beyond digital technology. Think about, I have a kind of riff about clothing as a technology. How can we think about clothing as a technology that can be used in different ways to promote different kinds of social behavior between people? So I think there are a lot of things you can do as an educator to sort of change things up. I think the mistake is either taking the one-size-fits-all command and control approach that administrators say you should do, or just trying to kind of be a student and act like a student, because you really can't act like a student and be an educator at the same time. Does that make sense? So a little bit more about angry professors, because I love angry professors. What might be less obvious to the, okay. I told you about the freezing laptop guy. So this is my favorite guy. He's shown right here. If an authentic angry professor moment is captured in earnest, either by students with cell phone cameras in the audience or by tech support recording the class for posterity, Such outbursts might be remixed, remediated, or parodied later. After Cornell lecturer Mark Talbert, shown here, interrupted his lesson plans for 2 minutes to seek out and castigate the student who had emitted what he called an overly loud yawn, his faculty temper tantrum was watched by over 700,000 people on YouTube. I think it's over 1 million now. In the video, as Talbert insists on maintaining the boundary between what he calls informal and impolite, he makes theatrically menacing comments like, and this is an actual quote, "My bad side is as bad as my pleasant side is pleasant." Hunts for the offender among the rows of anxious students, armed only with their electronic clickers, and finally yells that the guilty party should walk the hell out. Soon after the video was posted, Talbert became the subject of ridicule with themed t-shirts, a Facebook-organized yawn-in to protest classroom conditions, and a number of dance remixes featuring digital modulated and synthesized versions of Talbert's eruption with "My bad side is bad as my pleasant side is pleasant," serving as the refrain. So there's some fantastic auto-tuned angry professor videos. Some angry professor incidents do prove to have actual physical and legal consequences for faculty who lose their cool. At Valdosta State University, Professor Frank Rybicki was charged with battery after closing a laptop in the hands of a 22-year-old female student who refused to go offline during his mass media class. Rybicki had accused her of, now the number of these cases that involve people working with either media or technology, is of course something that you can't, it's never like the medieval French history class that it happens in. It's always in one of ours. So Rybicki had accused her of visiting non-course related websites, and an argument had ensued. Students who came to Rybicki's next class meeting were greeted by police officers who had come to interview witnesses and warned against discussing the case on Twitter or Facebook. Yet generational allegiance would do little to shape loyalties in the Rybicki case. In online comments, many students at VSU expressed support for their professor and contempt for their classmate. Over 100 students joined the Team Rybicki Facebook group that was created to rally others to his cause and to organize protests to his treatment by authorities. A number of youthful supporters wore Team Rybicki t-shirts to the trial. In an interview after his acquittal, Rybicki described how he, quote, "went to put the laptop down, she tried to pull it away from me, and she claimed her finger got stuck." Although Rybicki, quote, "didn't see the finger get stuck," and argued successfully at trial that he had no intention to cause her any physical harm. Although Rybicki argued that the real issue in the case was the right of the professor to maintain the classroom as a learning environment, university administrators were still planning to terminate his contract and to end his tenure-track employment as a result of the altercation. So what's interesting to me is that this is also a global phenomenon, and you'll find these angry professor videos in at least a dozen different languages on YouTube. And you see both remixed ones, you see ones that are hoax ones, and you see the same pattern of the angry professor moment that involves an interaction around technology, that involves this higher education setting in which things get out of control. So I already kind of talked about this particular case, the Stone professor's case, and the question of kind of how you manage telepresence. I think it's also interesting to notice how the engagement problem gets imagined as a question of how student faces function as a kind of interface. So have any of you seen this video? It's called "A Vision of Students Today" by Michael Wesch. It has a huge number of views. In "A Vision of Students Today," a group of Kansas State students, over 200 students, hold up signs as they describe their alienated condition. So some of the signs say things like, I will read 8 books this year, 2,300 web pages, and 1,281 Facebook profiles. I will write 42 pages for class this semester and over 500 pages of email. I Facebook through most of my classes. I bring my laptop to class, but I'm not working on class stuff. So what this is a video that people who are arguing for digital media and learning in higher ed often point to as an example of why it's necessary to take action. However, the story of this video is actually a little more complicated. So this is actually an outtake from the video. Because one of the things that people have pointed to is that is pretty obvious when you look at the kind of the faces of the students as a kind of display mechanism, and they sit there impassively while they hold up these cards, is the absence of students of color. And Wesh said, well, no, there were students of color in the class. I just ended up not using that footage. And so the question became, well, wait, so you're editing this footage? Because the kind of myth of this is that this is this participatory student project, that this was supposedly created on a Google Doc. So all 200 some students created this composition by collaboratively working together on a Google Doc. And yet Wesh says, oh, but there was this interesting moment about race, but I edited it out because it didn't seem like there was time for it. So what I might suggest it would have been a more progressive thing to do might have been make the whole database of film clips available to all the students, let them remix the collection together as they chose. The other myth about this video that this story about the excerpted student points out is supposedly this was written by students in this Google Doc as a prepared class exercise. And yet, when Wesh explains about the outtake, he says, well, a lot of students just wrote things on cards the day of the filming. And this was an example of just something that they did not as part of the Google Doc collective enterprise, but as something that they did spontaneously on their own. But I think what is interesting in thinking about this question about kind of how do we think about the classroom itself as a space in which we're thinking about interfaces, there's a comment by Mark Marino that I think is interesting. He says, following up on his highly played and first Web 2.0 video, Wesh focuses this video on how today's students have changed with respect to their relationship to classroom technologies and technologies brought to the classroom, such as laptops, cell phones, and pens. In this video, Wesh uses superimposed quotations and other comments to make a point that seems implicit in part of using, that technologies offer new possibilities but do not completely eclipse or erase previous technologies. In this case, he juxtaposes contemporary technologies with that preeminent display technology, the blackboard. Further, his students also become display media, or rather, this shows the ways in which they can use any surface, including the walls of the room, as sites of inscription, means of participation, directly contrasting with the blank screens of their faces and the reports of their less than full class participation. So if you haven't seen the video, you should definitely take a look at it. So maybe, since I want to allow plenty of time for discussion, let me just maybe look at the last. So we've talked a little bit about using video technology as a way to create an impression of telepresence so that students outside of the physical classroom can have a classroom experience somewhere else. There are also experiments in higher education that have to do with ubiquitous computing and bringing in mobile devices, particularly sort of large distribution experiments involving freshmen. So the idea is you give all freshmen an iPad, you give them all an iPod, and I want to tell you a little bit about this experiment, which involved giving all incoming students, this was actually from my own institution, a wireless device, and this took place 10 years ago. So this is an HB Jornada mini computer, many of which ended up on eBay or as part of e-waste. But there were some interesting things that came out of the experiment. So let me just say a couple things about this experiment. mass distribution of handheld digital devices to first-year students on college campuses offered new ways for undergraduates to read the university and its interfaces, and to be instructed in new modes of digital reading by campuses interested in promoting electronic rites of passage that are markedly different from those of the codex book. With mobile technology, students are encouraged to read textbooks, read buildings, and even read each other in ways that seemingly counter traditionalist anxieties about post-literacy and the distraction panic. How should we look back at a decade of large-scale distribution efforts aimed at giving mobile computing to first-year college students? 4 case studies: the 2002 distribution of HP Jordana Pocket PCs at UC San Diego, the 2004 distribution of iPods at Duke, and the 2010 and 2011 distributions of iPads at Seton Hill and the University of Maryland, tell us about institutional attitudes about how students should decipher the messages encoded in higher education. What's interesting to me about these mass distribution efforts, I call them gadget distribution efforts, is that when you look at the surrounding rhetoric of the distribution, you find out a lot about how the institution thinks it's solving a particular problem involving the university. So you also find out how people are imagining their own institutions and what they think they're solving by distributing these devices. So when you look at the material surrounding the UC San Diego distribution, and Bill Griswold wrote a lot of interesting things about the distribution. He wanted these devices to be able to allow students greater access to spaces of the university that were otherwise invisible. So he imagined the device as sort of being able to make visible faculty and research opportunities and things that would otherwise be set off, kind of closed off behind closed doors by being able to kind of hold up this kind of magical window. Now at Duke, when they handed out iPods, they had a very different idea about the university. They primarily wanted it not as a decoding device, but as a recording device. And so the idea was this first year of college is this magical time, and here you have this big data device that lets you capture everything. And the reason you need this device is because you just can't take it in fast enough. So you need this device that will be more efficient than you as a note taker, and you will be able to capture and archive all of this stuff from your college experience. The ideology on the iPad is not as clear, other than kind of, I think, a fascination with either paperlessness or a kind of interest in using QR codes as a way to again, decode university spaces and places. But it's not quite as clearly about access in the same way that I think this distribution was sort of trying to be. So
Stanford gave iPads to its med school.
Really?
And I went, every first year med student got an iPad. I went and watched a lecture over there. A third of the students had paper. A third of the students had laptops, and a third of the students had iPads. It wasn't a controlled experiment, it was just about the fractions of the class. As far as I could tell, all the students with paper were paying attention, taking notes. All the students with iPads were following along the slides, engaged in class. And everybody who had a laptop was on Facebook or doing other work. And so it was an interesting, the medium predicts your engagement moment.
And it was funny because in one of the reports, this has a very actually unwieldy user interface. So using this pen is actually really difficult for students to do. They argued that this was actually a virtue and that students so had to concentrate on doing the input that they couldn't possibly be surfing the web or doing other activities because it took so much attention to just operate the device. So it's a kind of interesting case in which the device is sort of determining the interaction in a way. Well, let's open it up to questions. So I'll sort of save you thinking about the university as a design problem or thinking about the kind of tension between participatory culture and the Coursera experiment maybe for our discussion, and kind of let you know that I'm part of an experiment called Feminist Dialogues on Technology that's trying to do a series of linked online and offline courses where materials are shared a little bit more dialogically, and where students can be content creators of the course as well. So thank you. Yes.
So my question is kind of like related to what someone else asked about. In the 50s, maybe you had people trying to escape the reality with comic books or newspapers or whatever. So it's kind of like now, suppose Stanford partners with like a third world country or something, where people don't have cell phones or laptops, but you're still like over the internet broadcasting some lecture or something. Has anyone done any studies like that to relate the two, like what the attention span of people would be in such a study? Because it seems like everyone just does these studies based in places where people have access to like these other technologies.
So that you're asking a really interesting question, and there's a lot of research that was done on the One Laptop Per Child project. Some of it pretty critical of the kind of missionary mentality of and the ways that it assumes that kind of a problem can be solved with a consumer device. Do you know the work of Francois Barre, who looks a lot at how people use social and public computing? And what his researchers often found is that people preferred having infomediaries, that they actually didn't necessarily want direct access to information. They actually preferred the social interaction around the information rather than just having the kind of the fantasy of sort of direct access without an intermediary isn't something that's universally appealing to people in all situations. I think in the Coursera case, there's a lot of discussion about how this allows forms of elite Western higher education to reach beyond kind of first world institutions, which is, I think, both a laudable goal and one that should be always thought about critically. So what does it mean to assume that you're not co-constructing knowledge with your participants elsewhere? What does it mean to kind of just use the kind of broadcast model as a way that could have a kind of missionary component to it as well, in spreading a certain kind of ideology about what learning should be that might not necessarily match. I mean, there's also a lot of interesting research by Bill Maurer about digital money, mobile money, and his group, the Institute for Money, Technology, and Financial Inclusion, that looks at how people are using mobile money around the world in ways that don't necessarily match the kind of narrative about entrepreneurship and capital that will magically spread with the devices, that actually there's a lot of fighting between families and struggles about how the device changes social interactions. And the last piece that I think is important in thinking about with Coursera is that 80% of the people who are in Coursera courses abroad have higher ed, right? They have college degrees already. And I think one of the things I discovered from when I went to this meetup, I actually drove up with a 25-year-old computer programmer from Belarus who had a degree from a former Soviet Union country that she felt wasn't recognized in the United States and wasn't valued. And so it was that strong desire to have that US brand associated with your educational profile that I think is actually sometimes a strong motivator for people to want to participate in these courses. And J.T. Mitchell wrote, what was the name? Poison Ivy was the essay that he wrote about the kind of branding of American universities. He did this whole thing about Harvard versus MIT. I'm a Harvard person, and I thought it was absolutely, completely true. So that there's that what's desired is a branded commodity rather than an actual learning experience. Sorry for the long rant.
Like finds a battle array between students and teachers.
I argue that that's actually not the real battle. That's a false way to imagine what's happening. that what's really happening is that there are these kind of two sides that have these different ideas about technology, but they actually share common assumptions about the digital generation. And neither of them are really helping the educational situation very much, because they're kind of arguing for this. Either, let's go entirely digital, let's blow up the university. The university is the problem, not the solution. Professors are the problem, not the solution. Or you have people who just want to return to some fantasy of 1950s America that never was, at least based on my reading of media history.
So my point is I've never really, like either here or at my undergrad, I've never really seen problems associated with students using laptops or smartphones in class. Like I've never seen a professor be agitated that students might be multitasking at the same time. Is that different at some universities than at others?
Yeah, and it might, where'd you do your undergrad?
University of Illinois.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's certainly complaints from University of, which campus? Yeah, I've certainly heard faculty there complaining about distracted students. The question is distraction really the problem? Might be the real question. Or is it that students don't feel the learning is meaningful? Maybe that's the real problem. And maybe we need to, instead of reducing distractions, we need to focus on how students can feel that learning achieves some goals for them. Like, how is, this is the rhetorician in me, right? It's all about audiences and purposes. So who's the audience and what's the purpose? Like, those seem the fundamental questions.
I'm sort of curious if any of these issues don't really have to do with technology at all. And then I guess the question would be then how the technology modulates the underlying issue. In particular, something like, in a large classroom, if a lot of people aren't paying attention, that's terrible for them. And too bad they're not getting any return on their money, or that they're spending on education, and like how we view that so many people go to college today just because that's what you do and you have to do it. And so presuming that any sort of arrangement would get those kids to be engaged, maybe, a lot to ask of the institution.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of people who would argue that the problems have more to do with large kind of macroeconomic patterns involving pressures on universities to deliver certain kinds of education and not others. I recently spent a week with our faculty from our visual arts department who were doing a kind of visioning retreat process. And a lot of that education is, according to bean counters, very expensive because you work in small groups on design projects, and you can't scale it up. So this that many might argue that the tensions have more to do with pressures for changing academic labor than really technology itself.
It's interesting how your description of technology and distractions, and that there might be a deeper underlying cause, seems really similar to the medicine for distractions.
Right.
It feels really parallel.
Yeah. It was funny to hear you talk about the first time you were on television. The first time I was on television, I was in a documentary called "Failing to Learn, Learning to Fail," and it was a documentary about what was then called hyperactivity, and now we call it ADD or ADHD. And we were the successful family because we had money and we had Ritalin. And my brother and I were both sort of shown as being the kind of exemplary upper middle class family who, the kids were, so it was like 3 failure stories, and then we were like the success story. And it actually ended with my brother like literally running on the beach off into the sunset, as Cat Stevens music plays. And of course, that Ritalin proved to be incredibly destructive. And there were things that I found out about that family dynamic that was definitely not healthful, and that certainly medicalization is something to be critical of, in much the same way that assuming that a technology solves a problem, you should ask questions about. I think technology makes things more interesting, but I think when it solves one problem, it often creates other ones, and that can be interesting too. Yes?
Sometime in your talk you said something about we are measuring objectives which are not affect, and affect is known to be important for learning.
Right.
I wonder if the problem is that we are measuring something versus not measuring anything at all to begin with, or have we moved from measuring affect to not measuring affect?
Well, if you say, I don't care about assessment, I think you will pretty much, you can't hold an administrative post at a university in this country. I care deeply about assessment because I think it creates an opportunity for conversation. So I say, yes, go ahead and measure things so that you have things to discuss. But but watch out for assuming that progress is always, that you can get a narrative of progress or a narrative of crisis out of the set of measurements that you've made. Measurements help you identify problems that you can then talk about. And I think actually the solving of the problems has more to do with the conversation than the measurement. And that often it's, people get really defensive about those measurements, and I think that's not helpful too. There are a lot of super anti-assessment people, particularly, I'm part of this kind of feminist camp of academics, and a lot of those people they will say assessment is anti-feminist, and they really strongly believe in that. I disagree, because I think otherwise, if you don't have these activities, there's no common rhetorical object for people to have a conversation around. Like you're not creating that energy, that focus that people need.
So I guess the real problem is that we don't have a conversation around assessment rather than we don't have assessment.
I would say that.
Okay.
I tend to be on the side of more conversation rather than less, as you could probably tell.
That's probably a good note. Thanks very much.
All right.